Take the blame, my mother whispered. Her fingers dug so hard into my shoulder that I felt the bite of her acrylic nails right through my heavy wool coat. He has children. You have nothing to lose. She shoved me toward the open driver's side door of my own vehicle. The night air tasted heavily of burnt rubber and leaking radiator fluid, while just beyond the wrought iron gates of the church retreat center, my older brother Caleb bent over in the decorative bushes. The sound of him vomiting was loud and wet in the damp autumn darkness. He wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his expensive suit jacket, completely refusing to look at me. My father stood near the crumpled front bumper. Thomas Holloway was methodically wiping down a glass liquor bottle with his perfectly pressed handkerchief, and he did not look like a man whose son had just crashed a luxury vehicle into a brick pillar. Instead, he looked exactly like a chief executive officer handling a minor scheduling error. "Kill the perimeter lights," my father told a security guard standing in the shadows. Then he turned to me. The man who had preached about absolute truth for 3 decades picked up my leather purse from the gravel, tossed it into the passenger side footwell, and forced my car keys into my cold palm. I am 40 years old, and I work as a municipal risk advisor for the city. My entire career is built on assessing disasters, calculating liabilities, and finding the truth buried under public panic. Standing there in the dark, I did not scream. Nor did I argue with the people who had raised me. Instead, I looked down at my phone. The dashboard camera application was open on the screen. A green progress bar hit 100%, confirming the collision footage had successfully finished uploading to my private cloud account. I pressed the power button, locking the screen, and slipped the device deep into my coat pocket. Gravel crunched heavily under thick rubber soles. A county patrol cruiser had pulled up quietly, and Officer Maya Brooks stepped out into the dim light. My father intercepted her immediately. His voice dropped into that rich, comforting tone he used on Sunday mornings to calm a congregation of thousands. Thomas introduced himself, pointed a steady finger directly at me, and explained that his daughter had been driving under the influence. My mother stepped forward right on cue. Ruth Holloway placed a trembling hand over her mouth, producing real tears, and began weeping softly about how hard it was to watch a child struggle with drinking. She painted a vivid picture of a family exhausted by my supposed failures. Officer Brooks did not offer a comforting prayer. Pulling a heavy metal flashlight from her duty belt, the investigator separated us with a sharp hand gesture, ordering everyone to step back. The bright beam swept over the wrecked hood, illuminated the deployed airbags, and finally settled on my brother. The officer stepped closer to Caleb. She shined the light directly on his chest, revealing a fierce red welt that slashed diagonally down from his left shoulder across his sternum. It was the unmistakable signature of a driver-side seatbelt locking during a severe front-end collision. Then Maya walked over to me. She illuminated my coat, my neck, and my chest. I had no red marks, and there was absolutely no airbag dust on my sleeves. The investigator leaned down, inspecting the driver's seat my mother had just shoved me into. The leather bucket was pulled far forward, entirely too close to the steering wheel for someone of my height. Officer Brooks turned off her flashlight. She looked squarely at the woman who gave birth to me. "Why did you put your daughter in that seat?" the officer asked. My mother froze, and the practiced tears stopped falling. My father tried to step in. His tone hardened as he told the law enforcement official she was making wild assumptions, and he demanded she call the police chief, a man he played golf with every Tuesday. "You should watch what the car recorded," I said. My voice was completely steady. I pulled my phone from my pocket, unlocked the screen, and handed it over to Officer Brooks. The playback started immediately. The cabin camera footage was crystal clear, showing Caleb sitting in the driver's seat, tipping a bottle back, and talking on his phone right as the vehicle veered off the gravel path. The sound of metal crunching against solid brick blasted from the small phone speaker. Then came the audio recorded right after the impact. Caleb groaned, fumbled for his phone, and dialed our mother. "I will tell them I was driving," Caleb said on the recording, his voice whimpering. My mother answered through the car speakers, her tone sharp and authoritative. "No, bring Claire here. People already believe she drinks. Put her purse in the front," my father added on the recording. "I will handle security." The video ended. I watched my mother realize what had just happened. She stopped breathing, her chest freezing completely, while her eyes locked on the small black rectangle in the officer's hand. Officer Brooks took 2 steps back. She secured my phone in her vest pocket and keyed her shoulder radio, requesting an independent county investigation unit immediately. She ordered church security to back away from the vehicle and instructed my family not to speak to each other. Caleb finally looked up from the bushes. He wiped his mouth again and mumbled that his head hurt, claiming he suddenly could not remember clearly who had been behind the wheel. I stood in the cold, damp air and watched the people I called family crumble under the weight of their own recorded words. They had fully intended to send me to a concrete cell tonight just to save their golden child. But the betrayal that kept echoing in my mind was not the sight of my father wiping down the liquor bottle or my brother playing the victim. It was the exact sentence my mother had spoken into the phone before I even arrived at the gates. People already believe she drinks. I had not set foot inside their church in 15 years, and I drank maybe 1 glass of wine a month. I wondered, looking at the pale face of the woman who raised me, just who had built a lie so massive that an entire town believed it, and exactly how long they had been using my name to protect their own. The county precinct waiting area smelled like ammonia floor wax and burnt coffee. I sat on a hard plastic chair, watching the wall clock tick past 2 in the morning. I was not there as a suspect because Officer Maya Brooks had made that explicitly clear when she placed Caleb in the back of her cruiser. Maya walked through the swinging double doors carrying a manila folder, and her expression told me everything I needed to know. The investigator confirmed my cellular location data matched my statement perfectly. My device had been resting on my kitchen counter right up until my mother called with her frantic lie about my brother bleeding. More importantly, the precinct had already pulled the security footage from a gas station 2 miles down the highway. The time-stamped video showed Caleb buying a bottle of bourbon at 11 o'clock. My brother was entirely alone, fumbling with his leather wallet before stumbling back to the driver's seat of my vehicle. Through the glass partition, I could see my father pacing the length of the hallway. Thomas pressed his phone to his ear, shouting at the lead attorney for the church. The phrase "private family matter" echoed through the sterile corridor. The man who had spent his life preaching about accountability was desperately trying to put a lid on a pot that had already boiled over, but he had failed. The official dispatcher logs showed church security had waited 11 full minutes before calling emergency services. They used that critical window to summon me to the gates. Inside an interrogation room, Caleb sat with his head resting on the metal table. He had blown well over the legal limit. A duty officer handed him a clipboard, and my golden child brother signed a preliminary statement claiming he simply could not recall who had been driving. Officer Brooks walked over and asked if I wanted to release my dashcam footage to the press right then. A younger version of myself might have uploaded the video and watched the church burn. I work in risk management, and I know that panic is cheap. Revenge without a verified paper chain is just noise. I declined her offer, asked for a formal receipt proving the department had secured the original cloud file, folded the stamped paper into my pocket, and called a cab. Morning light crept through the blinds of my apartment. I had not slept, and my coffee had gone completely cold on the kitchen island. At exactly 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed with an alert from the New Covenant Fellowship official social media page. I opened the application, and my mother stared back at me through the screen. Ruth sat in her mahogany home office, wearing a soft pastel cardigan, looking directly into the camera with sorrowful eyes. The woman who raised me did not say my name because she did not have to. My mother spoke to her thousands of followers about a sudden family crisis involving a loved one who had long battled the demons of alcohol. Her voice broke perfectly on the word demons. She asked the congregation for prayers, stating that a mother must fiercely protect her successful children while never giving up on her broken ones. The comment section exploded immediately. Hundreds of church members posted praying hands, praising my mother for her endless grace and expressing deep pity for the heavy burden she carried. My phone vibrated again in my palm. Naomi was calling. My sister-in-law sounded exhausted, her voice tight with unshed tears. She asked me, point blank, if I had actually been behind the wheel. I told her no. A heavy silence stretched across the cellular connection. Naomi had 4 children sleeping down the hall, and she had spent her entire marriage listening to my parents tell stories about my supposed instability. She wanted to believe me, but 15 years of conditioning is a hard wall to break down. My brother's wife whispered that she had to go, hanging up before I could explain about the video. I set the phone face down on the granite counter. The absolute silence of my apartment pressed against my ribs, thick and unyielding. My mother was executing a masterclass in public manipulation, using her soft voice to build an airtight prison around my reputation. Then my laptop chimed. An email had arrived in my personal inbox from a masked address. The subject line consisted of exactly 8 words. They have been preparing this for 15 years. I clicked the message open. There was no text in the body, only a single attached document titled Claire Restoration Master Narrative. My hand hovered over the trackpad for a long moment before I double-clicked the attachment. The document looked exactly like official pastoral counseling records. Pages of detailed notes described rage episodes, intervention attempts, and relapse patterns that never happened. Then I scrolled to the final page and stopped breathing. A formal admission of alcoholism stared back at me. At the bottom of the page sat my signature. It was an exact match for the messy cursive I used in my 20s, lifted straight from an old charity volunteer form I had filled out a decade and a half ago. Below the forged signature, a highlighted instruction note sat at the bottom margin. Use this file only if Claire threatens ministry reputation. The blood pounded in my ears. The car crash setup had not been a sudden moment of parental panic, and my family had not simply seized an opportunity to save Caleb last night. They had built a loaded weapon, kept it in a desk drawer for 15 years, and waited for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. I moved the cursor to the top of the screen and opened the Document Properties tab. I needed to know who had digitized this forgery. The metadata loaded in a small gray box, and the creator line listed a specific user account. The name on the screen belonged to Lena Ortiz, the woman who used to be my mother's most trusted executive assistant. Dana Mercer slid a yellow legal pad across her massive oak desk. The civil attorney specialized in nonprofit fraud, and she absolutely did not deal in raw emotion. I sat in her downtown office, listening to the low hum of the air conditioning, wanting nothing more than to post the forged document online for the whole world to see. Dana strictly forbade me from doing that. Posting anything on the internet would immediately destroy our legal leverage. She explained that we needed a locked chain of custody, cryptographic hash files, and read-only copies before making a single public move. The lawyer pointed her silver pen at the digital signature timestamp on the pastoral record. That specific stamp proved the document had been created 3 years after I walked out of the church doors for the final time. The creator account belonged to Lena Ortiz, but the final modifications came from an internal protocol address mapped directly to a computer sitting inside my mother's executive suite. Revenge that lasts requires a paper trail they cannot dispute, Dana warned, tapping her pen against the wood. If you post this now, they will call it a fake. We locked down the metadata first. 2 hours later, I drove down the interstate to Nashville. Rain lashed against the windshield, matching the steady, cold anger settling in my chest. I found Lena Ortiz sitting at a corner table inside a quiet coffee shop near the university. The former executive assistant looked absolutely terrified, clutching a paper cup of tea like a physical shield against her past. Non-disclosure agreements and the sheer terror of a powerful congregation ruining her new corporate life tumbled out of her mouth. She offered a dozen panicked excuses for why she could not help me. I did not beg, nor did I raise my voice. I simply placed my phone on the table, pressed play, and let the unedited dashcam audio run. My mother's voice drifted through the small device speaker, telling my father to bring me to the crash site because people already believed I drank. All the color drained from Lena's face. The woman finally realized the fake restoration file she had helped manufacture was currently being weaponized to send me to a state penitentiary. A quiet, trembling confession spilled out into the open. My mother had explicitly ordered her to copy my signature from an ancient charity volunteer form. Ruth Holloway had dictated every fake relapse note, invented every manufactured family intervention, and instructed her assistant to make the file look incredibly authentic. I was just following my boss, Lena whispered, her hands shaking so badly that hot tea spilled onto the wooden table. Your silence cost me 15 years of my good name. I kept my voice perfectly flat, leaning forward just enough to force her to look at me. You do not get to play the victim today. The guilt finally broke through her carefully constructed fear. Lena agreed to sign a sworn affidavit, provided Dana shielded her from the church legal team. She reached into her expensive leather tote bag and pulled out a small black flash drive, sliding the plastic across the table like it burned her fingers. The drive contained archived emails and draft speeches that she had smuggled out when she finally quit. One particular message from my mother stood out instantly. It instructed the finance board that if I ever questioned the ministry expenses, the elders needed context. Another digital folder simply bore the label, "The Claire Problem." A cold clarity settled over my chest. My family had not destroyed my reputation because they thought I was weak, and they had not done it out of some twisted sense of parental embarrassment. They painted me as unstable to create a permanent smokescreen. The entire narrative was a weapon, built and waiting to be used, simply because I had once started asking where the charity money was actually going. I clicked on the final video file in the drive. It was a high-resolution rehearsal recording. The thumbnail showed my mother standing on an empty auditorium stage, testing the dramatic lighting for a major gala event. The title superimposed over her face read, "A Mother Who Never Gave Up." Dana Mercer leaned across her massive desk and pressed the spacebar. The high-resolution recording immediately filled her laptop screen, casting a harsh white glow across the quiet office. My mother stood under a single bright spotlight on an empty auditorium stage, testing the dramatic lighting for the annual Autumn Gala. Ruth held a microphone, practicing her cadence. She delivered a flawless, heartbreaking monologue about a daughter drowning in the dark waters of addiction. Her voice carried the perfect amount of rehearsed sorrow. An unseen assistant called out from the dark seating area, checking the audio levels and noting that the previous year had seen a massive spike in general donations right after my mother used this exact narrative. A warm, practiced smile spread across my mother's face. "Claire's story makes donors open their wallets," Ruth said, reaching back to adjust her microphone battery pack. "Do not let facts ruin it." A heavy oak door groaned open on the recording, and the sound of expensive leather shoes echoed across the stage. My father walked into the camera frame. Thomas Holloway did not look shocked or offended by his wife admitting the entire tragedy was a complete fabrication. "Keep the names out," my father instructed, pointing a warning finger at the empty seats. "The story is what matters." Bile rose hot and bitter in my throat. The two people who had raised me both knew my supposed addiction was entirely invented. My mother had not simply sacrificed me at the retreat gates out of panic to save Caleb. She had spent a decade and a half building a highly lucrative fundraising machine, and my manufactured pain was her absolute best-performing product. Sunday morning brought a fresh wave of public performance. My phone vibrated endlessly with notifications from the church live broadcast. I sat on my sofa, watching Ruth peer through the screen from behind a massive arrangement of white lilies. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue, describing an angry, unstable child returning home only to cause chaos and destruction. Right beneath the video player, a bright blue donation link flashed onto the screen. Dozens of comments flooded the chat window in real time. People I had known since childhood offered fervent prayers for a mother enduring such endless heartbreak. My thumb hovered directly over the upload button on my phone. Releasing the stage rehearsal footage would shatter her pristine performance instantly, ripping the mask off in front of thousands of watching eyes. Dana reached across the sofa and gently pushed my hand down, shaking her head. Releasing the video now would just look like a bitter, chaotic family feud. We needed a verified financial motive to prove actual corporate fraud. For the first time in my life, my silence stopped being a heavy burden and transformed into a deliberate, calculated strategy. We went back to the printed documents. Lena pointed a shaking finger at an email sitting near the top of our evidence stack. The message came directly from my mother, ordering the accounting department to charge the recent public relations work to the Restoration Fund. That specific financial account existed for one purpose only. It was strictly promoted as an emergency resource to provide safe housing for women escaping domestic violence. Dana leaned back in her leather chair, tapping her pen against her chin. The attorney explained that a single email was never enough to guarantee an indictment. We desperately needed canceled checks, the real accounting ledger, and someone from the finance board willing to testify under oath about the missing money. A specific name jumped out from the forwarded email chain: Eleanor Price. The elderly widow had served on the finance committee for 3 solid decades, and she possessed a reputation for being absolutely meticulous. I stepped out into the hallway, leaning against the cool plaster wall, and dialed her number. The line rang 4 times. Eleanor finally answered, her voice brittle and thin, like dry autumn leaves. I asked her straight out about the media charges hidden inside the restricted charity accounts. A very long, heavy silence stretched across the cellular connection. "I kept copies," the old woman finally whispered. "Because your father told me not to." Fluorescent lights hummed a low, steady rhythm inside the basement archive room of the local credit union. Eleanor Price placed a heavy cardboard storage box onto the metal table, and the air immediately smelled like stale dust and aging paper. Her late husband had served as the deputy treasurer for decades. The widow had quietly moved his physical files out of the church offices right after his funeral, acting on a quiet instinct she had ignored for entirely too long. Eleanor reached into the box. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she pulled out a thick stack of canceled checks, laying them flat on the scratched metal surface. I leaned forward, looking closely at the blue paper slips. The memo lines all read emergency housing or domestic violence support. The payees told a completely different story. The money from the restoration fund had gone directly to a luxury auto garage, a high-end public relations firm, an out-of-state addiction treatment center, and a private security company. Dana Mercer compared the dates on the checks against a printed calendar. Every single massive payout matched a week when Caleb had supposedly gone on a private spiritual retreat, or a morning when his car had mysteriously appeared in the church parking lot with a brand new bumper. I signed the board minutes without reading them, Eleanor whispered. The elderly woman refused to meet my eyes, staring instead at her own tightly folded hands. I trusted your father. She reached deeper into the cardboard box and produced a printed spreadsheet. Thomas Holloway had maintained a shadow ledger, keeping it completely separate from the official church accounting software. Eleanor had printed a partial copy a year ago when the official numbers finally stopped making sense to her. My eyes tracked down the columns. The initials CH appeared next to dozens of damage control payments. One massive wire transfer carried a sickening description. Claire narrative refresh. The money had gone directly to a crisis communications consultant. Dana reviewed the spreadsheet, her expression shifting into pure professional focus. The attorney confirmed we finally had enough probable cause to petition a judge for subpoenas covering the bank records and the vendor invoices. Then Eleanor pointed a frail finger at two massive cash withdrawals near the bottom of the page. The payee names belonged to two former female staff members who had suddenly left the organization 3 years ago. Caleb had quietly harassed them right out of their jobs. My father had bought their silence, paying their settlement agreements using the exact fund meant to protect vulnerable women from abusers. Sickness twisted my stomach. I pushed the settlement documents back across the table, shaking my head. I instructed Dana to have her legal team contact their representation through official channels only. We were not going to ambush those women, and I flatly refused to use their trauma as a convenient prop for my own vindication. Eleanor smoothed the fabric of her wool skirt. She knew perfectly well that handing over these copies meant the finance board would publicly suspend her. The organization she had built her entire social life around would permanently exile her before the next Sunday service. My faith does not require protecting Thomas, Eleanor stated. Her voice no longer shook. The oldest person in the room had just become the first one willing to accept the absolute consequences of telling the truth. Dana flipped to the final page of the shadow ledger. She tapped her pen twice against the paper and slid the document toward me. A specific contingency plan sat neatly at the bottom of the page, dated 6 full months before my brother wrecked my vehicle. Crash response, the ledger entry read. Use Claire file if needed. The asphalt at the Luxury Recovery Center was slick with morning rain. I parked near the visitor entrance, watching my older brother walk toward my car. Caleb wore a gray cashmere sweater, looking entirely sober and completely exhausted. He climbed into the passenger seat, bringing the smell of peppermint gum and stale fear into the confined space. He wanted to make a deal. My brother offered to take full responsibility for the drunk driving charge, provided I publicly stated that our parents had orchestrated the entire cover-up without his knowledge. He leaned against the headrest, rubbing his temples, and claimed he had been completely paralyzed by the fear of losing his 4 children. I did not offer him any comfort. Instead, I unlocked my phone, opened the audio file, and pressed play. My brother's own whimpering voice filled the quiet car. I will tell them I was driving, he said on the recording. Then came my mother's sharp command to put me in the driver's seat, followed by the sound of Caleb remaining perfectly, cowardly silent. Caleb flinched as the playback ended. He argued that he had been heavily intoxicated that night, insisting the church attorney had shoved a typed statement in front of him the next morning when he could barely think straight. You were sober when you signed that statement, I said, looking directly at the man who had shared my childhood. You sat in a police precinct with clear eyes and put your name on a document that could have sent me to prison. He begged me to understand his position, pleading that our parents had manipulated him his entire adult life. He offered me the names of the 2 women who received the settlement payouts, confirming that Thomas kept a shadow ledger. In exchange, Caleb desperately wanted me to tell the media he was merely a victim of a toxic family system. "And what did you think I would lose?" I asked. He had absolutely no answer to that question. I told him to get out of my car, refusing to trade my integrity to save his public image. Driving back toward the city limits, I called Dana Mercer and relayed the information about the settlement names. The attorney had already moved forward with her legal strategy. Through the ongoing county investigation, the prosecutor had secured a lawful subpoena for my brother's cellular records. Dana read the extracted text messages to me over the phone. The morning after the crash, Caleb had sent a direct message to our father. "Thanks for fixing it again." A second message had gone out to his own pastoral staff 2 hours later. "If Claire talks, use the restoration notes Mom put together." My brother was not a helpless pawn. He knew exactly what the fake narrative was, and he actively requested that they use it to destroy me. Later that afternoon, Naomi asked to meet me at a quiet diner near the interstate. She needed my authorization to collect her husband's personal items from my impounded vehicle. My sister-in-law slid into the vinyl booth, her shoulders tight with exhaustion. I did not try to convince her with my own words. I simply placed my phone on the laminated table and played the unedited dashboard camera video from start to finish. I let her hear the crash, the conspiracy, and the silence. Then I showed her the printed transcript of the text messages Dana had secured. Naomi stared at the paper. Her eyes locked onto the word again. A quiet realization washed over her face. She whispered about 2 separate occasions when Caleb had vanished on a private spiritual retreat, remembering how the family sedan had magically appeared in their driveway with a brand new bumper both times. My brother's wife reached into her heavy tote bag and pulled out a manila folder. She slid it across the table. The folder contained a printed family calendar, 3 massive invoices for out-of-state treatment centers, and a printed email from my mother demanding absolute secrecy regarding Caleb and his medical leaves. Naomi had kept the receipts. "I will not let my children learn this is protection," Naomi stated. Her voice was barely louder than the diner background noise, but the absolute resolve in her tone was unmistakable. She was not ready to walk into a courtroom today, but she had finally stopped defending the lie. I left the diner and drove straight to the law firm. We finally had the witness testimony, the financial breadcrumbs, and the digital proof of a conspiracy. Before the sun went down, Dana Mercer officially served a severe preservation notice. The legal document ordered the church, my parents, and the private security vendor to immediately cease deleting any emails, financial records, or surveillance footage. Exactly 2 hours after the courier delivered those notices, a security log registered a sudden change. Bryce Keller received a phone call from my father. The head of church security immediately climbed into his personal truck and drove directly toward the county collision storage yard, where my wrecked vehicle was currently sitting in the dark. The call came early the next morning while I was pouring my first cup of coffee. Officer Maya Brooks spoke in a tight professional clip, informing me that the yard manager at the county collision storage facility had just found the police seal completely severed on my impounded vehicle. Someone had broken into the lot overnight, taken a heavy tool to the dashboard, and smashed both the front and cabin cameras into jagged pieces of plastic. Panic did not rise in my chest, because I understood exactly what my father was trying to accomplish. Thomas Holloway believed that by destroying the physical hardware, he could cast reasonable doubt on the authenticity of the digital files. He simply did not realize how cloud architecture actually functioned, and he certainly did not know about the paper trail sitting inside my attorney's briefcase. I drove straight to the law firm. Dana Mercer was not upset about the vandalism. In fact, a sharp, satisfied smile crossed the lawyer's face as she spread our documents across her massive desk. My father had walked blindly into a devastating legal trap. Dana pulled out the official police receipt from the night of the crash, proving Officer Brooks had witnessed and secured the original footage. Next to it, the attorney placed the cryptographic hash document, establishing that the cloud backup had been perfectly preserved before the vehicle ever left the church gates. The shattered plastic sitting in the impound lot did not delete a single frame of evidence. It only proved that a highly organized effort was currently underway to obstruct a criminal investigation. By noon, the county detectives had completely unraveled the clumsy break-in. Bryce Keller had used an outdated maintenance code from the church vehicle fleet to open the security gate. A license plate reader mounted on a nearby traffic light captured his personal truck leaving the area. The impound yard surveillance video showed the head of church security ripping the memory card from the device, smashing the lenses, and tossing the remnants down a nearby drainage ditch. Most importantly, cell tower data confirmed a specific digital handshake. Bryce had received a direct phone call from my father while standing right next to the ruined dashboard. The timeline was absolutely fatal for the organization. Dana had served the official preservation notice ordering the church to protect all evidence exactly 2 hours before Bryce drove to the storage yard. Destroying the camera was no longer just a desperate cover-up. It was a documented, active felony happening in real time. The county prosecutor brought Bryce in for questioning that same afternoon. The security director quickly realized my father was preparing to let him take the entire fall for the vandalism. Facing severe prison time and the permanent loss of his professional license, the loyal employee immediately requested a defense attorney and offered a full cooperation agreement. Dana called me just before sunset, reading directly from the preliminary statement Bryce had provided to the authorities. "I did not choose Claire," the security director told the police. "Ruth did. Thomas just told me how to make it look real." 3 heavy weeks passed before the state nonprofit fraud unit finally arrived at the New Covenant campus. I sat in a parked car across the street, watching investigators carry dozens of cardboard boxes out of the main administrative building. The legal net had tightened meticulously. Bryce Keller had officially signed his cooperation agreement, handing over every email my father had sent regarding the security camera destruction. Lena Ortiz had submitted her sworn affidavit alongside the stage rehearsal video, and Eleanor Price had surrendered the canceled checks. My mother immediately went on the offensive. Ruth broadcast a live video from her pristine living room, claiming the church was under a coordinated spiritual attack. She used the word persecution 4 times in 3 minutes. Yet for the very first time, the comment section fractured. Half the congregation offered fervent prayers, while the other half started asking very specific questions about the missing charity funds. The emergency board hearing took place 2 days later inside a sterile conference room at a downtown hotel. This was not a criminal courtroom, but rather an internal corporate reckoning guided by independent legal counsel. I sat next to Dana Mercer at the far end of a long mahogany table, watching my parents enter the room. They looked furious, projecting righteous indignation as they took their seats. Eleanor Price did not flinch. The elderly widow stood up, walked around the table, and placed copies of the diverted checks directly in front of the board president. She read the true purpose of every single payment aloud, her voice echoing sharply off the paneled walls. Then Dana connected her laptop to the room monitor and pressed play on the rehearsal video. The committee watched my mother stand on a stage and admit that my fabricated tragedy made donors open their wallets. Ruth immediately interrupted the playback, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief and loudly claiming her words were being completely taken out of context. Dana simply let the video continue running. My father walked onto the screen, bluntly instructing his wife to keep the names out because the story was the only thing that mattered. Absolute silence consumed the conference room. I did not deliver a dramatic speech. I simply confirmed to the independent lawyer that I had never attended an addiction treatment program and had never authorized the church to use my life as a fundraising tool. A former female staff member, dialing in through a secure audio line, then quietly confirmed that her hush money had been paid directly from the Domestic Violence Fund. The board president called for an immediate vote, and the committee unanimously suspended both Ruth and Thomas Holloway pending a full forensic audit. My mother instinctively covered her face with her hands, producing loud, theatrical sobs. She waited for the inevitable rush of sympathy, fully expecting the elders to abandon their chairs and wrap their arms around their beloved founder. Nobody moved. The men and women who had supported her for 30 years simply gathered their legal pads and looked away. Thomas slammed his fist against the table, his face flushing dark red. The former pastor threatened that every major donor would abandon the organization if the board removed him, shouting wildly about the massive financial empire he had built from nothing. His rage only cemented their decision. The fractured foundation completely shattered that same evening. My phone rang just after dinner, and my brother's frantic voice filled my ear. Caleb begged me to issue a public statement claiming his severe addiction had clouded his judgment during the police interrogation. "You were completely sober when you signed that statement," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured. A sharp intake of breath echoed over the cellular connection. Caleb had put the call on speakerphone, desperately hoping his wife would help him plead his case. Instead, Naomi spoke directly into the microphone. "She is right," my sister-in-law stated quietly. Naomi ended the call right then. An hour later, she packed 4 suitcases, loaded her sleeping children into her minivan, and filed preliminary paperwork for a legal separation. She agreed to testify for the state regarding the hidden treatment centers, demanding only that the media keep her kids entirely out of the spotlight. When the shared power collapsed, family loyalty vanished right along with it. By Friday morning, Thomas submitted a sworn affidavit to the prosecutor, claiming Ruth had invented the entire false narrative without his knowledge. My mother immediately retaliated by leaking internal memos proving her husband strictly controlled all security and financial decisions. Caleb hired his own defense attorney, issuing a press release that blamed both of his parents for a lifetime of relentless emotional manipulation. They were no longer a united front. The perfect family was actively tearing itself apart to survive. 2 long weeks of grueling depositions crawled by. I sat in Dana Mercer's office, drinking bitter coffee while staring at a massive mountain of sworn affidavits. The county prosecutor finally held every piece of the puzzle. The state possessed the dashboard camera audio, the forensic scene report detailing the seatbelt marks on Caleb, and the security yard surveillance footage. More importantly, the authorities had Bryce Keller completely on record regarding the direct phone call from my father. Dana closed her leather briefcase, explaining that the massive nonprofit fraud investigation would take many more months to completely unravel. However, we did not have to wait for those specific financial indictments. A county judge had just reviewed our preservation notice and immediately signed expedited arrest warrants. The magistrate authorized the immediate charges based entirely on the active, ongoing destruction of evidence and the conspiracy to file a false police report. My mother requested one final, private meeting inside the main church sanctuary, right before those warrants could be formally executed. I agreed to meet her, but I established absolute boundaries. Dana knew my exact location. A plainclothes officer waited patiently in the vestibule, and a concealed digital recorder ran silently inside my coat pocket. Ruth Holloway stood near the polished wooden altar, bathed in the soft, colorful light bleeding through the stained glass windows. She did not offer a single apology, nor did she shed any practiced tears. Instead, the disgraced founder offered me a business transaction. My mother promised to hand me the executive leadership position for the entire women's ministry, provided I drop my civil lawsuit and publicly state that our family had simply panicked on the night of the crash. She painted a glorious picture of reconciliation, claiming we could easily spin this massive public scandal into a powerful new ministry of healing. "Did you ever love me when I wasn't useful?" I asked, my voice cutting sharply through the empty, cavernous room. Ruth did not answer the question. She simply adjusted her expensive silk scarf, her expression hardening into a mask of pure annoyance, and warned me that I was throwing away my only chance to be truly loved by this community. Right on cue, the heavy wooden sanctuary doors groaned open. 2 state investigators walked deliberately down the center aisle, presenting a judge's signature. They arrested my mother for conspiracy, inducing a false police report, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Across the sprawling church campus, a separate law enforcement unit placed Thomas in handcuffs directly inside his executive office. Caleb received his formal summons an hour later, facing severe charges for driving under the influence alongside his own conspiracy counts. Several months passed before the preliminary detention hearings began inside the county courthouse. My father stood before the bench in a wrinkled suit, gripping the wooden podium with white knuckles. Thomas immediately launched into a booming, self-righteous speech, attempting to deliver a grand sermon about his decades of spiritual service and the heavy burden of leadership. The presiding judge struck his wooden gavel incredibly hard against the sounding block. "This is not your pulpit," the magistrate warned, his voice echoing loudly across the gallery. My father closed his mouth, his jaw working in silent shock. For the very first time in his adult life, the powerful man completely failed to control the narrative, the running time, or the final conclusion of his own story. Dana nudged my arm, pointing toward the prosecutor's table. The state attorney had just unsealed the complete, unaltered version of the restoration ledger. The stolen charity funds were substantially larger than Eleanor Price had ever suspected, and the final page contained a long list of paid-off victims who had never even made it into the official board minutes. 9 months dragged by before the final sentencing hearing arrived. The state financial investigators methodically unpacked the massive fraud. Bank subpoenas, vendor invoices, and the complete restoration ledger painted a perfectly damning picture of stolen charity funds. My father stubbornly refused the initial plea agreement, absolutely convinced his wealthy donors would pay his mounting legal fees. Instead, the elite congregation quietly withdrew their financial support, leaving Thomas entirely isolated. Ruth finally accepted a partial plea deal, though she still insisted to anyone who would listen that she had simply been protecting her grandchildren. Caleb accepted a guilty plea for driving under the influence, making false statements, and conspiracy. The judge made it completely clear that his severe addiction required treatment, but the illness did not erase his criminal choices. Bryce Keller secured a lighter sentence through his early cooperation, yet the security director permanently lost his state license and his entire career. The courtroom benches were packed tight on the morning of the sentencing. The prosecutor built the case layer by undeniable layer. Officer Maya Brooks walked the judge through the physical seatbelt evidence and the dashboard camera footage. Lena Ortiz confirmed the forged signature on the pastoral documents. Eleanor Price authenticated the shadow ledger and the altered board minutes, her voice steady and clear. Bryce testified about the explicit order to smash the cameras. Finally, Naomi took the stand. My brother's wife calmly told the court that her husband had been completely sober when he signed the false police statement. When the judge called my name, I walked slowly to the wooden podium. I did not deliver a dramatic, tearful speech, nor did I demand maximum penalties. I kept my victim impact statement incredibly brief. My family did not merely try to take my physical freedom, I told the silent courtroom. They manufactured a fake version of my life, and they used that lie to generate money for 15 years. They taught an entire community that a woman without a husband or children was simply a disposable asset. The judge did not offer them any mercy. Ruth Holloway received 4 years in state prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The court ordered her to pay massive restitution and banned the disgraced founder from ever managing a nonprofit organization again. My mother also lost the civil suit, forcing her to sign a legally binding public correction, stating I had never been diagnosed with or treated for alcoholism. When Ruth turned around to seek comfort from her former supporters, the people who used to line up to hug her simply looked away. Thomas Holloway received 7 years behind bars for fraud, obstruction, evidence destruction, and conspiracy. The judge issued a lifetime ban on his nonprofit management, ordered his shell company assets seized, and mandated the removal of his name from all church buildings. The man lost his money, his absolute control, and his precious right to speak the final word. Caleb received 2 years in prison. He lost his pastoral credentials, surrendered his driver license, and faced mandatory rehabilitation. Naomi finalized their separation, securing full legal authority over their 4 children, and the court explicitly forbade my brother from using his kids as a shield in any future public relations campaigns. The New Covenant Fellowship did not close its doors. An independent legal board completely restructured the organization, transferring the restoration fund to an outside domestic violence charity. The new leadership provided immediate legal support to every single woman who had been coerced into signing a non-disclosure agreement. During the first public restitution meeting, Eleanor Price stood at the pulpit and slowly read aloud the names of every victim Thomas had erased from the official minutes. The new board asked me to lead their internal ethics program. I politely declined the offer. This organization does not need another Holloway standing on a stage, I explained. You need a system that does not rely on one family. 1 full year passed. I received a formal letter confirming every fake pastoral file had been permanently deleted from the church servers, and the public correction had been mailed to every single donor. I sold my wrecked luxury vehicle, but I kept the police receipt and the recovered digital memory card inside my fireproof safe. They were not trophies. They were quiet proof that the truth existed long before anyone else decided to believe it. I met Eleanor, Lena, and Naomi for dinner at a quiet restaurant across town. Naomi told me the children were thriving in therapy, completely removed from the heavy burden of church media campaigns. Right before dessert arrived, Eleanor looked down at her tea and quietly confessed that she had been the one to send that very first anonymous email. The elderly woman had been too terrified to call me directly, but she had decided to at least unlock the door. Leaving the restaurant, I checked my phone. A message waited in my inbox regarding my new appointment to the City Council Committee for Nonprofit Accountability. The screen displayed my official title, Claire Holloway, Municipal Risk Advisor. For the first time in my life, my last name did not feel like a heavy chain belonging to my parents. For 15 years, they told the world I had no life worth believing. They were wrong. I had a life. I simply stopped letting them write it. When you look at the aftermath of this story, the ultimate lesson is not merely about exposed secrets or legal justice. It is a profound reminder of what happens when love is replaced by control and when family loyalty is twisted into a weapon of self-preservation. For years, Claire was told that she was disposable simply because her life did not fit the traditional mold her parents built for public applause. But your value as a human being is never defined by your marital status, whether you have children, or how neatly you align with someone else's expectations. You possess inherent worth, and no one, not even the people who gave you life, has the right to treat your dignity as a sacrifice for someone else's mistakes. True family love does not demand that you swallow lies, accept abuse, or carry the blame for sins you did not commit. When a family system protects a dangerous dynamic in the name of keeping the peace, it is not practicing love, it is practicing enablement. Protecting someone from the natural consequences of their destructive actions does not save them. As you saw with Caleb, it only robs them of the chance to mature, while destroying everyone else trapped in their orbit. Genuine accountability is the highest form of respect you can offer to yourself and to those you love. Another critical truth this journey teaches you is the subtle danger of silent compliance. So often, good people choose silence because they hope time will fix the misunderstanding, or because they fear being labeled as bitter and disloyal. But silence does not buy peace. It only grants manipulative people the power to keep writing a false narrative about you. Choosing to stand up for yourself is not an act of revenge or malice. It is an act of necessary self-preservation. When you establish firm boundaries, document the truth, and refuse to participate in a shared lie, you take back the pen and reclaim your own life story. Forgiveness does not mean allowing toxic people to retain access to your life, nor does it require you to play a role in their public theater. You can wish people well from a distance while keeping your personal space completely secure. Truth has a quiet, immovable weight, and while lies may sprint ahead in the short term, facts will always outlast the noise. Standing in your truth might feel lonely at first, especially when an entire community is conditioned to believe a well-rehearsed performance. But as long as you hold onto your integrity, you will always find solid ground beneath your feet. As you reflect on Claire's path from being framed to reclaiming her name, think about your own journey and the boundaries you hold in your life. Have you ever found yourself cast in a story you did not write, or pressured to take the blame just to keep the peace for people who failed to protect you? If you have ever had to find the quiet courage to stand up against unfair expectations and take back your own truth, please share your experience in the comments below, because your voice might be the exact reminder someone else needs to know that they are not alone.